You're listening to Wild Culture, a podcast discussing consumer culture and the powerful influence of business strategy. Good morning. Big question today. What was the last thing you bought? Now, for me today, the last thing I consciously bought was this morning's coffee. Last night, it was a song on iTunes that I actually, if I'm honest about, have a little bit of regret over. But maybe for you, it might have been your groceries, or it could have been the train ticket for your morning commute. The reason I'm asking you what the last thing you bought was is because I already know the one answer no one is going to give. My mind doesn't even go there, even though it was probably the last purchase all of us made. And we won't give this answer because this thing that we're consuming right now is completely invisible. It makes no noise and you can't touch it. But it's powering the device you're using right now to listen to this podcast. Now, if you're at the train station, it's also powering aspects of the train line. It's powering your laptop. It's keeping the cheese and the milk and, of course, the wine cold in the fridge. I'm talking about electricity, which is the topic of today's episode. And if you're listening for the first time, welcome. I'm Tanika. I'm a strategic planner, marketer, researcher, and author. From a consumer culture perspective, electricity, it's fascinating, right? Now, in business, we like to put the things that we sell, that's our business offering, into boxes. Usually that's either going to be the product box or the service box. But electricity is this kind of weird mix of both. If you're a consumer listening in, think of it a little like a vending machine. The cans of soft drink inside are the product that you pay to consume, but the machine itself has to be stocked. It has to be wired into the wall and maintained for those bottles and cans of Coke and lemonade and water to even exist and function, fall out when we put our coins in. That's where the service part comes into it. But here's where it gets interesting. Unlike the can of Coke, you can't see electricity. You can't smell it. And for safety reasons, you definitely shouldn't try to touch it. It's just in the ether around us. It's invisible. And, probably if it wasn't for having power outlets in the wall and the power lines, in your street, or that one friend that we all have who's a Sparky, we wouldn't really give electricity much of a second thought. And because of that, because it's not top of mind, there's this quirk in our consumer behavior where we don't knowingly consume electricity. Instead, we consume what electricity does for us. So we don't experience the electricity itself because we physically can't. So we experience what electricity does for us. We also notice, though, when we don't experience it. In fact, a power outage is usually the only time we kind of acknowledge that the service exists at all. Sometimes that's a very conscious choice. We go out of our way and we want to, book some remote cabin in the woods to completely disconnect and just shut off from all the stuff in the world. But other times being without power is really frustrating for us consumers because we live our lives around devices and the appliances, and they demand an uninterrupted flow of power. So the moment that flow stops, everything we know just stops along with it. All of which makes tracking the consumer experience, frankly, a bit of a pain in the ass. Because if you ask a person, how was your experience with electricity today? They'll probably have to think about it for a second and mentally think through the list of devices that they use that they have hooked up to the grid. Consumers don't have a direct and emotional relationship with the power grid, the way that we do with our iPhones, our smart TVs, our coffee machines. So there's no direct tactile interaction with the product, which means that our behavior isn't driven by the product. That's why it's fascinating. But if the power goes out while you're working from home, forcing you to get out of your sweatpants and drag yourself into the office, suddenly you're going to have a very, very loud, very passionate opinion about it. Because the service was interrupted, that means your routine was interrupted. And, sometimes that can just bugger up your whole day. So how do we understand the consumer relationship with electricity? Well, it isn't really a traditional consumer experience at all. It's a user experience because we don't buy the product for its own sake. We just use what it powers. So that this indirect relationship that we have with it is based entirely around usability and the user friendliness of it. Now, there's a much bigger reason to why I wanted to place that experience. And it's because there is a disconnect, pardon the pun, between the energy industry and everyday consumers, everyday human beings. The energy sector believes that everyday consumers both need and want more information and more explanations and more education about the technical side of why things are the way that they are. But consumers are not students. Most consumers expect that the industry will take the headwork, the guesswork out of it. Now, there are a lot of problems that get solved by the executives and employees in every single industry. That's what a job is. In the energy sector, executives have to be concerned about peak demand, the age of assets, and what's going to happen when everyone turns on their aircon at the exact same time in the middle of summer on a 40-degree day. Because they understand the technical considerations that are at play there. But everyday consumers just aren't aware of the ins and the outs of electricity because we're not in that mindset. It's not top of mind. And where this shows, and it's best reflected, is in market research. And there's plenty of global studies out there that prove this exact point. And what they prove is that if a researcher asks a consumer a technical question about electricity infrastructure, or say, for example, tariff structures, the consumer will usually tell you that they have no idea what you're talking about. But if you conduct in-person observational research and actually take the time to walk around their property with them, consumers do know what those things are. They just call it something else. So you kind of have to tease it out of them, the language set that they're using. But what that means is that there is this big jargon gap and a communication mismatch between the language used by companies in their studies compared to what consumers say they know versus what they actually have at their home and their property. And that communication mismatch turns into anxiety for the consumer when the bill arrives. So if we look at data from consumer advocates like Energy Consumers Australia, or if we look at data from SEC Newgate and Edelman, for example, you see a consistent years-long trend where people are deeply, deeply stressed about the cost of living. And in the top couple of things that they're concerned about the most and that they are up all night thinking about, it's electricity. And as I said, this is years deep, so it hasn't changed over the years. They're still worried about it. So much so that some consumers really fear opening their electricity bill because for them, they know that it's going to take out their whole weekly pay. And let's Let's contextualize that for a second. So we're paying to consume this invisible product. Our relationship is an indirect experience with a service. Therefore, it makes perfect sense that we resent paying for something that we can't see, can't hold, and can't touch. So the question is, will we ever be happy paying for electricity? And it's a curious point because these days, many consumables, and electricity is a type of consumable, many of them are digital. They live in the wavelengths around us. You know, we're not buying DVDs anymore. Instead, we stream. We don't have good old floppy disks. These days, we have cloud storage. So we're holding fewer physical assets because we've realized that tangible things can hold just as much value as intangible things like subscription services. And we're completely comfortable buying things we can never, ever hoard in our cupboards. So if we can be happy like that, paying for Netflix every month, why do we hate paying the power company? Can we ever be happy paying for electricity? And will we ever consciously think about electricity every time we use it? Those questions show us whether the consumer's behavior and perspective will ever change. My prediction is that the answer to those questions hangs on 5 distinct factors that directly cause that consumer user experience. And the only way for us to ever change behavior, as we know, is to change the experience. So let's go through these 5 factors one by one. The first factor is convenience, which is the simplest of all of the 5. Basically, the more devices and digital services that make our lives easy and that we're happy with, the more dependent we become on the power that feeds them, just so that we can keep using them. That convenience breeds reliance, because why would you bother looking for something else if you can get the job done with electricity? So that convenience is probably super important. Not the most important of these 5, but super important. The second factor is consistency. The more interruption-free electricity becomes, the more we appreciate its value. This is exactly what home solar and battery storage are driving for, is that value. When supply is perfectly consistent, the less scarce it is for consumers, but there's a dual aspect to it. It also means that the safer it is for companies to invent and sell us even more devices and appliances that are going to rely on it. And being able to use those devices without interruption, that is exactly what makes consumers happy. The historical challenge, though, has been managing the grid itself so that electricity supply can be consistent. When you have a suburb with all different sized homes pulling all different amounts of electricity at very random and different times of the day, it creates these little peaks and valleys, volatility in demand. And balancing all of that is much harder now that the grid needs to juggle this mixture of old school coal and more modern renewables like the wind and the solar that we're seeing pop up everywhere. Then there's the challenge of recruiting enough people with the right capability to do the work of fixing supply related issues and building completely new infrastructure. But in Australia and most places in the world, we also have fairly extreme climate fluctuations, and we have local wildlife that likes to wander, and those things get in the way of having perfect consistency. Now, battery companies have observed and understood that this is important for consumers for a very, very long time. Because every single time the power in a home went out, they sold more batteries. The only problem was the consumer had to leave the house to go and buy more batteries, which is how we arrived at this concept of rechargeable batteries. And some of you listening might recall the TV ads in the late 90s for Energizer rechargeable batteries. They had these little plastic cradles that you plug directly into the wall. And what Energizer did was they understood the consumer need for power to always be there, wherever it was that they were. So they tapped into the concept of taking power with you, making it portable. But they also identified that consumers had anxiety over their power running out, and they had anxiety about the hassle over going out and buying more batteries. So what they did to counter that anxiety is they marketed the relief or the peace of mind over never having to worry about the battery going flat. Now, this is important because the residential solar batteries that we have on homes today are simply that rechargeables concept made mega, scaled up so big that they take away the anxiety of the house being without power. So batteries are a way for consumers to manage their loss aversion. But right now, residential battery storage still isn't efficient or affordable enough for the average home to move off grid and ditch the energy companies forever. And consumers are trying to do just that. So it's not uncommon to see neighbours meeting in the street over a beer on the weekend to compare notes and discuss what type of battery each other is getting installed or has already had installed so that they make the right choice. And who knows, maybe that might not be so much of an issue as we see more community batteries pop up in the future, and it eradicates the need for that type of community behavior and the need for consumers to feel anxiety over buying the wrong thing just to achieve consistent supply. So that's number 2. We need more consistency to have more happy consumers. The third factor is the inadvertent sale. This is where a subliminal marketing strategy kicks in. And this will probably be the one where you go, oh yeah, how did I not realize that? The energy sector relies on a very clever economic trick called complementary goods. So to put this simply, electricity companies don't have to market their product for them to achieve sales because Apple, Samsung, Sony, Miele, so on, so forth, they do it for them. Every single time a consumer buys a new fridge, a bigger TV, or a faster smartphone with a better camera, they are guaranteed to consume more electricity, which creates a tandem success story. But that success carries a downside. While the energy companies make more money every single time there's a new tech product launched, they're the ones that inherit the customer's frustration. Because while we love the end user experience of our devices, we don't love the ongoing cost of running them. So we want our cake and we want to eat it too. And if you have a chat with your friends, you'll probably find this one to be true. Most people will happily spend thousands of dollars a year on getting a takeaway coffee every day or getting the latest smartphone, yet they'll complain about spending a few $1,000s a year on their power bill. And it's not communicated clearly that there is an attachment between those two costs. You buy one, you're buying the other. So when you pick out a new washing machine, yes, it has the star rating for energy usage slapped right on the front, but it's ambiguous, right? The dollar amount that it's actually going to cost to operate each year. So we have this question over, is it $50? Is it $900? I don't know. So electricity is an unexpected cost and an unbudgeted cost on the lifestyle the consumer chooses. Another great example of this that I want to use is air conditioning. And I've actually got a specific family member in mind when I say this. Some consumers, they need the aircon running for their health and for their comfort. And that's why they were happy to go out and buy the appliance, and they love how it runs, and that's why they keep turning it on. It just does the job that they bought it to do. But what they hate is paying for the electricity bill so that it can function. And what those consumers are really unhappy with is the inadvertent sale and the ongoing relationship with electricity that you're attached to every time you buy an appliance or a device. Because the phone and the aircon and the TV, they have one-off fixed costs. You pay it, you're done. You're not paying that every year, unless you want to. With electricity, you pay it frequently, and the amount varies by season, by day, by month, etc. At the moment, that inadvertent sale doesn't sit at the front of the consumer's mind because they get swept away with the shiny new gizmo, whatever it is that they bought, the new gadget. So the electricity payment is an afterthought, which becomes an irritation if they didn't budget for it. And that's where the trouble is for the energy companies. In experience design, the irritation that the consumer feels as a result of an inadvertent sale is what we call a moment of tension or a pain point in the consumer journey. And it's the exact reason why we hate getting the electricity bill. To have happy consumers, the energy sector needs to eliminate that tension. And when it does that, the industry will demonstrate to its consumers that it is customer-centric, but resolving it is going to require far more communication with consumers than the industry is used to. And that is a bit of a challenge from a regulatory perspective at the moment. So that's number 3, the inadvertent sale. The fourth factor is the cost. Technically speaking, electricity is a luxury. It's not a comfortable thought, but it is. Yes, we live in a digital world, but healthy, able-bodied human beings do not require a smartphone, social media, or a fridge to survive. We might not enjoy living without those things, but history proves people can live without appliances, which means electricity is a choice. And it's a choice to buy convenience and consistency because they give us the luxury of more time and an easier way of life. And that's what consumers pay for. That's the value, as I was saying before, that consumers are after. It's not the kilowatts that come through the power outlets in the home. I know the electricity company is selling kilowatts, but they're not the thing that the consumer perceives that they're paying for as part of their experience. The issue is that the cost and the way that we live today versus 100 years ago makes it feel like the choice to have electricity is a non-negotiable. Like, could you imagine telling your boss, oh, sorry, I don't have a phone. You'll have to send me a letter in the mail. Or could you imagine telling your friends that you don't have a TV and no, you haven't binge watched blah, 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 blah series? So the cheaper electricity is, the lower the barrier to entry for everyone. And to give you some real world context about what we're actually dealing with here, there's a recent pulse survey that CanStar conducted that showed the average annual electricity bill is between $1,252 and $447 a year. That amount of money is the equivalent of buying a new laptop each year. Except when you pay for electricity, you don't get to hold a thing. You don't get a tangible thing that you can put on a shelf. You just get to keep on using the things that you already own. Multiply that annual cost by the millions of homes and businesses connected to the energy grid in Australia, and the market value flowing here is easily over $30 billion a year. What's fascinating about what determines whether you're paying at the higher or the lower end of that scale is the number of people living under one roof. So if you're sharing a house with a group of friends, you're paying more. If you're in those busy childbearing age ranges, you're paying more. So the younger and the larger that your household is, the higher your bill is going to be. But even if you live completely alone, you still have a basic bill that is sitting at around $1,252 a year. And what that shows is that there is a basic cost just to have power into your home and keep the lights on. And right now, we know that certain pockets of the population struggle to afford power. If we could magically rewind back to, let's say, 2008 prices, it would radically ease that cost burden for millions of households. But there is a full circle aspect to this when it comes to families. If the baseline cost of running a home climbs, it increases simply because those homes have more people in them, then people are going to be less inclined to have kids, which is just sensible thinking, right? Most people buy what they can afford. For them to afford the time and the easy way of living that we get from electricity, those benefits, those value adds, then we need to make sacrifices in other areas of life. That's just 1 + 1 = 2. When you layer the rise of artificial intelligence over this and the effects it's having on job security and its global energy demands, we are creating a society where the cost of living is changing the very way we live. For a very good long while, we've treated electricity as it's been a basic expectation. Like, I deserve it just because I live. That's why it's not top of mind for people when they go about their day. But if the cost of living moves us away from the survival of the fittest that we know, and we step into a survival of the richest phase, that's where consistent energy will be repositioned as a luxury good. Now, that positioning is a very big problem for energy companies because they already know that for some consumers, it already is a luxury. When even a single consumer struggles to afford the same way of life as everyone around them, it changes how the entire energy sector is viewed. Because Australians have this beautiful love thy neighbour, no one gets left behind mentality. And we see that when we have massive natural events where everyone digs deep to pull everybody along together. So it is simply not socially acceptable for anyone to go without power because we believe that it's a basic expectation in just the Australian way of life. So it gets treated as though it's as essential as the air we breathe. So having even one household that can't afford to keep the lights on affects the way all consumers are going to see the energy sector. That invites heavier scrutiny. It destroys consumer trust. And where that ends up is it eventually strips these companies of their social license to operate, which is what they need in order to function and perform and to be able to do the really big work that they have to of keeping the energy supply consistent and established. So that's the fourth. That brings me to the fifth factor, which is staying on trend. This means that electricity has to do something it doesn't do. That is, it has to become more culturally popular than the devices it's powering. And this may be just the best thing the industry can do to make consumers happy. Now, it might sound very peculiar to describe a $30 billion utility as a trend. But look at the vocabulary around the energy sector right now. We are moving through what's called an electrification movement. Now, if you work in marketing, you know exactly what the word movement means. A movement is just a fancy catch-all word for a trend with mass market appeal. So this is the energy sector's way of trying to create product appeal by making it sound sexier and progressive and very necessary. And you know, there's a couple of good examples that is already occurring. Like, look at electric vehicles. EVs have become the Louis Vuitton handbag of the car world. People are also trading kilowatt hours just as they would shares or cryptocurrency through platforms such as Amber Electric, which is just the most perfect demonstration that trends in the industry are important to consumers. So the global strategy right now is to electrify everything because it's a convenient way to power up all of the devices and all of the things that we use to live easy lives. And in terms of behavior, it's something that we've done before. So if you look at what we did with architecture and building design post-World War II, we started designing homes around how heat filled a room and where cars and toilets and appliances lived. Now, much of that layout change was driven by things like hygiene, smells, food shelf life, but it was also driven by corporate marketing and the ability to mass produce standardized parts of the house. So we literally changed the functional design of shelter to be easier both for the people who live in a home, but also for the people who build the homes. So history proves that what human beings use and their experience of what they're using changes over time. We've only had electricity as a consumer product for what? Maybe 100 years? Now that's, of course, taking electricity as a force of nature out of the equation. But as a product and a service that consumers buy, it's a baby in the consumables world. Despite that, despite being a newbie, most of us go through our entire day using it and racking up the bill without realizing just how frequently we are choosing to make that purchase. And that right there makes electricity quite possibly the most successful, most profitable, subliminal product strategy the world will ever see. But we haven't reached the point where we think it's cool. And we probably never will look at electricity in the same way we do Apple or Nike or Rip Curl or, even water, which makes a very interesting comparison because buying bottled water has somehow become a trendy thing to do. So there is potential for electricity to become trendy. So that's the 5 factors: convenience, consistency, the inverted sale, cost, and trend. Those are the factors that will determine whether we will ever have humongous smiles on our face when that power bill arrives in the mail or whether we won't. So an interesting episode today, but a good one to have covered off, I think. That's it for today. Till next time, thanks for joining. Thanks for listening in to Wild Culture. If you found value in listening to our conversation today, please make sure you follow or subscribe to the show wherever you listen. Taking a quick moment to leave us a rating or review is the best way you can help other curious strategists and passionate spenders find us as well. Bye for now.